The horse had put a groom in the infirmary on Tuesday, and by Friday the new scullery maid had put the horse on its knees in the middle of the exercise yard, and the Duke of Aldermore watched the whole of it from his study window without moving for the better part of 10 minutes. Corvus was 17 hands of black temper, out of the best racing line Aldermore had ever bred, and he had not been ridden, led, or properly handled by anyone in 3 years. 40 men had tried him in that time, grooms, guest riders, 2 professional horsebreakers brought up from London at considerable expense, and every one of them had come away with bruises at best, and, in Pardo the second groom's case that very week, a broken collarbone. Roderick Fenn, 9th Duke of Aldermore, had inherited both the horse and the problem 18 months before, along with a dukedom his father had left in rather worse order than either the stables or the accounts suggested at first glance, and he had reached, by that Friday morning, the private and rather bitter conclusion that Corvus was simply unbreakable. Magnificent bloodline wasted on an animal too far gone in his own rage to be of use to anyone. He was standing at his study window composing, in his head, the letter that would finally authorize the horse's sale to a breeder desperate enough to take the risk off his hands, when he saw the new scullery maid cross the near corner of the exercise yard with a basket of washing on her hip, and saw Corvus, 30 feet off at the far rail, go suddenly and completely still. Maisie Tull had been at Aldermore House 4 days, hired on the strength of a good character from her last place, and a housekeeper too short-handed to ask many questions, and she had crossed that yard a dozen times already that week, without once troubling to look at the horse everyone below stairs called cursed. She was not looking at him now either. That was, Roderick would understand much later, rather the whole of it. She was humming an old, unremarkable 3-note phrase, tuneless enough that she likely did not know she was doing it, the kind of thing a person hums entirely without noticing, because it has lived in the back of their throat since childhood. And Corvus's head came up sharp at the sound of it, ears pricked forward, the whole coiled fury of him going suddenly, eerily quiet. He crossed the yard at a walk, not a charge, not the pinned ear-stalking gait every groom on that estate had learned to fear, a plain, unhurried walk, the way a horse approaches something it already knows, rather than something it means to test. Maisie, hearing hooves, turned with the basket still on her hip and went entirely white. Oh, she said, faint, and then, because there was nowhere sensible to run, and the horse was already too close for running to help, she did the only thing that came to her. She set the basket down, slowly, and held out one open hand, the way a person does without quite knowing why. Corvus stopped in front of her, and then, to the disbelief of 2 stable boys who had frozen mid-task at the sight of it, the horse folded his forelegs and knelt in the dirt of the exercise yard, lowering his great head until it was nearly level with the maid's outstretched hand. Roderick Fenn was across the lawn and through the yard gate before he had entirely decided to move, and he arrived breathless, having covered the distance at something considerably faster than a duke's dignified walk generally permitted. "Don't move," he said, low, to Maisie, who had not moved at all, standing frozen with her hand still hovering an inch above the horse's bowed head. "Miss, I don't believe I know your name. Please, very slowly, step back from him. That horse has broken a man's collarbone this week. He isn't going to hurt me, Your Grace." Maisie's voice shook, but she did not step back. "I don't know how I know it. I only know it the way you know a room is warm before you've properly thought about why." She lowered her hand the rest of the way and rested it, lightly, against the horse's broad forehead. And Corvus, 17 hands of animal that had put 40 grown men in the dirt, let out a long breath through his nose and stayed exactly where he was, kneeling in the yard, entirely still. I have no earthly explanation for it, Roderick admitted, 20 minutes later, in the estate office, with Maisie standing before his desk still faintly trembling from the encounter and the head groom, Rafe Kettering, hovering near the door with an expression Roderick could not immediately place. I have had 2 London breakers examine that animal and pronounce him unrideable and dangerous past reclaiming. He has not permitted a soul to touch him in 3 years. And you walked into my exercise yard humming to yourself, and he knelt at your feet like an animal out of a fairy story. I don't know why he did it, Your Grace. I have never once in my life handled a horse of that size. My father kept a dairy herd, and I have milked cows since I could walk. But I have never so much as led a carriage horse to water. What is your father's name? The question seemed to catch her off guard, and something crossed her face, brief, guarded, gone almost before Roderick registered it. Samuel, Your Grace. Samuel Toole. He is dead these 2 years, of a chest complaint, and I have been in service since, first at Denby Hall, and now here. Rafe Kettering, by the door, had gone very still. Roderick noticed the stillness, though he did not yet understand its weight, and he filed it away with the particular careful attention he had learned, over 18 months of untangling his father's chaotic estate management, to give anything that did not quite add up. You will forgive my curiosity, Miss Toole, but I find I cannot simply accept coincidence as an explanation for what I just watched. Would you be willing to try him again tomorrow? Not to ride. I would not ask that of anyone, given his history. Simply to see whether this morning was a singular event or something that might be built upon. I would be glad to, Your Grace, if it does not interfere with my duties below stairs. It will interfere with your duties below stairs considerably, Miss Toole, because I am about to have you reassigned to the stables at double your current wage, effective this morning, and I do not intend to hear any argument about it from Mrs. Pruitt's household roster. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face for the first time since the whole strange scene had begun. A horse that has cost this estate a groom's broken collarbone and 2 breakers' fees just knelt for a scullery maid. I find I am considerably more interested in following that thread than in keeping you polishing silver. The rest of the household took the change in the horse considerably less calmly than Roderick himself managed to. It isn't natural, said Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, on the 4th morning, watching from the kitchen door with her arms crossed. A horse that's put 6 men in the infirmary in 3 years does not simply go gentle because a scullery maid hums at it. I don't say the girl means any harm by it, Your Grace, but I'd have the animal watched close all the same, in case whatever's calmed him turns without warning. I have watched it myself every morning this week, Mrs. Pruitt, from that window there, and I have seen nothing in it that resembles danger. Roderick did not look away from the yard as he said it. I begin to think the horse was never dangerous in the way we assumed. I think he was grieving, in the only language available to an animal that cannot speak his grief aloud, and grieving creatures are not the same thing as vicious ones, however much they may look alike to a frightened onlooker. Grieving what, Your Grace, if I may ask? I do not yet know, Roderick admitted. But I intend to find out. The other grooms kept their distance from Maisie for the better part of that fortnight, uncertain whether to credit luck, witchcraft, or some genuine skill they simply could not account for. And it was only young Pardo, mending well from his broken collarbone, and grateful enough for it to have set aside most of his fear, who finally worked up the courage to ask her directly, "How do you do it, Miss Toole? Truly, I've been 3 years round that horse, and never once got closer than the far rail without him going for me. I don't rightly know, Pardo. I only know I don't ask anything of him. I stand where he can see me, and I let him decide the distance, and I don't take it personal, if the distance stays wide some mornings. Maisie kept currying the horse's shoulder as she said it, unhurried. I think most creatures, horses and people both, come round faster to someone who isn't in a hurry for them to. Pardo turned that over for a while, watching the horse lean, faintly, into Maisie's steady hand. I might try standing at the rail a bit longer myself then, see if he takes any more kindly to patience than he did to a lead rope. You do that. I'd be glad of the company, and I expect he would too, in his own time. She came to the yard every morning after that, and Corvus met her at the gate each time, calm as a carriage pony. And by the second week, Roderick had taken to watching the whole ritual from the same study window, unable to keep himself from it. She did not ride him. That had been her own stipulation, offered on the third day with a firmness that surprised him. I don't know what put that trust in him, Your Grace. And until I do, I'll not risk breaking it by asking more of him than he's offered freely. He knelt. He didn't say I might climb on his back. That is remarkably sound judgment for a woman with no experience of horses. It isn't horse sense, Your Grace. It's plain sense. A person who's been hurt bad enough to distrust every soul who comes near them doesn't want to be pushed the moment they show one flicker of trust. They want to be let go slow. Something flickered across her face, quick and private, and Roderick found himself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly Maisie Toole knew about being hurt badly enough to distrust the world. It was Rafe Kettering who finally, inadvertently, gave the game away, cornering Maisie in the tack room on the third week, his voice pitched low and considerably less friendly than the careful professional courtesy he generally showed the household staff. You'll want to be careful, girl. Playing at things you don't understand. That horse has a temper that's killed better handlers than you, and I'll not have the estate's liability resting on a maid's lucky trick with an animal she's got no business near. He hasn't hurt me once, Mr. Kettering, in 3 weeks of standing beside him. Luck runs out. I've seen it happen. Kettering's jaw was tight. You'd do well to remember your place, Miss Toole, and leave the horse handling to them as are trained for it, rather than trading on whatever your father taught you to make yourself interesting to his grace. Maisie went very still. What do you know of my father, Mr. Kettering? Kettering's face closed like a door, and he left the tack room without answering, and Maisie stood alone amid the bridles and the saddle soap, with her heart going hard against her ribs, understanding, for the first time, that the headgroom's hostility toward her had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with a name she had not spoken aloud in 3 years without care. She did not sleep well that night, turning the exchange over in the narrow attic room she shared with 2 other maids, trying to work out how a headgroom she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in 3 weeks had known her father's name at all. She had given it to the Duke in the estate office, certainly. But Kettering had not been present for that conversation, or so she had believed, and the discovery that he had evidently learned of it regardless sat in her chest like a stone she could not quite identify the shape of. She thought, too, of the years before Aldermore, of her father's slow decline after Denby Hall had also, eventually, turned him away once his old disgrace followed him there, of the particular quality of shame that had settled over their small cottage in his last 2 years, a shame he had never once explained to her fully, only borne, silently. The way a man bears a wound he does not believe deserves sympathy. She had asked him once, in his final illness, what had truly happened at the Newmarket meeting, and he had said only, "It does not signify now, Maisie. A dead man's protest changes nothing about what a living man decided to believe," and had never spoken of it again before he died. She understood, lying awake in that narrow bed, that she owed it to his memory to finally ask the question she had let go unasked for 3 years out of a grief too raw to examine closely. She went to Roderick that same evening, in the estate office with a composure that cost her considerably more than it showed. "I have not been entirely honest with you, Your Grace, and I find I cannot let it go on a day longer, not after what Mr. Kettering said to me this afternoon." She kept her hands folded, steady through long practice. "My father was not simply a dairyman who died of a chest complaint. He was head groom at this very estate until 3 years ago, when he was dismissed and disgraced on an accusation of doping a rival's racehorse before the Newmarket meeting. An accusation that ruined his name in every stable in the county and left him unable to find work anywhere a horse was kept. He never recovered from the shame of it. I believe the shame killed him considerably faster than any chest complaint did." Roderick sat very still, the pieces arranging themselves with a speed that left him faintly sick. "Samuel Tull, the groom my father dismissed. Your father, Your Grace, 3 years ago. The same 3 years Corvus has refused every rider on this estate." Maisie's voice did not break, though it came close. "My father trained that horse from a foal. He was the only man alive that animal ever properly trusted, and I have wondered, these 3 weeks, whether some of what my father taught him simply lives in me without my knowing it. The way I stand, the way I hum without thinking. Some particular they shared, that I've carried without ever meaning to." Roderick Fenn spent that night with his father's old estate papers spread across the desk, and by dawn he had found what he had not thought to look for 18 months before, when a dismissed groom's disgrace had simply been one more piece of his father's chaotic legacy to inherit and not examine too closely. The accusation against Samuel Tull had rested entirely on the word of one man, Rafe Kettering, then under groom, who had reported finding a vial of the doping compound in Tull's own tack box the morning of the Newmarket meeting, and who had been promoted to head groom within the month of Tull's dismissal. There had been no other witness, no trial, no magistrate, only the old Duke's own summary judgment, delivered on Kettering's word alone, and a groom of 15 years' unblemished service turned off the estate without wages owed or character given, on the strength of one ambitious man's convenient discovery. Roderick confronted Kettering in the stable office the following morning, the old papers laid out between them. "You found the vial in Tull's tack box, on the very morning you stood to gain his position by the finding of it. I have gone through the timing of every promotion on this estate since, Kettering, and I find your own advancement traces rather precisely to the exact month my father dismissed the one man senior enough to have stood in your way. I reported what I found. Your Grace, I'll not apologize for that. You'll not need to apologize for reporting it, if it was true. What I find myself unable to credit is that a groom 15 years in this family's service, who trained that horse from a foal with a patience nobody since has managed to replicate, would suddenly risk his entire livelihood doping a rival's animal, while the undergroom who discovered the evidence happened to inherit his position within a month." Roderick's voice had gone flat and cold. "I have written to 3 of the Newmarket stewards this morning, Kettering, requesting the original race day records. If your account does not survive that examination, you will answer for considerably more than a dismissal." The steward's records, arriving a fortnight later, told the story Roderick had already half suspected. The rival horse Tull had supposedly doped had in fact been found lame the morning of the race, a torn tendon, plainly documented by the course veterinarian, with no trace whatsoever of any doping compound in the animal's system. The accusation had never held up to actual scrutiny. It had simply never been properly scrutinized at all, because a duke's summary word had been sufficient to end the matter before anyone thought to check it. And a stable hand from that same Newmarket meeting, tracked down through the steward's old wage books, remembered plainly that it had been Kettering himself, not Tull, seen near the rival stable's tack room in the hour before the race, a detail nobody had troubled to ask about 3 years before. Because nobody had troubled to ask any questions at all once Kettering's convenient discovery had settled the matter. Kettering did not leave quietly once he understood the steward's records were on their way, and his final week at Aldermore was considerably uglier than anything he had yet attempted. He went first to Mrs. Pruitt, with a story calculated to do the most damage in the least time that Maisie Tull had engineered the whole business from the start, coaching the horse somehow with tricks learned from her disgraced father, in order to secure the Duke's particular interest and thereby avenge a grievance she had nursed for 3 years. It was, Roderick thought later, a clever enough lie in its shape, because it took every true fact of the case and simply inverted the direction of the scheming, and for 2 days it found some purchase below stairs, where old habits of suspicion toward the Tull name had never fully died, even without anyone quite remembering why. "I do not credit a word of it, Your Grace, Mrs." Pruitt said, coming to him directly, rather than letting the whisper spread further, "but I thought you ought to know what Kettering's been saying before it travels past this house. Thank you for bringing it to me plainly rather than letting it fester, Mrs. Pruitt. I find I have grown considerably more grateful, this spring, for people willing to say difficult things to my face rather than around it." Roderick's jaw had tightened. Kettering's story falls apart on its own timing. In any case, Maisie did not know I would take any particular interest in her before that horse knelt in the yard, and she could hardly have coached an animal she had never once approached before that morning. I will address it directly, in front of the whole staff, before it does any further damage. He did exactly that. The following evening, gathering the household in the servants' hall to lay out plainly what the steward's records had actually shown. Kettering's own presence near the rival stable, the veterinarian's documented finding of a torn tendon rather than any doping, the suspicious timing of Kettering's own promotion, and the whisper campaign, deprived of any ground to stand on once the true facts were spoken aloud to. Everyone at once collapsed within the week. Kettering left Aldermore in the night shortly after, a full week before the steward's complete findings arrived, and was never seen in that county again, and Roderick Fenn stood in the estate office with 3 years of buried truth spread across his desk and understood, with a grief that surprised him, exactly how much his own father's carelessness had cost a man who deserved considerably better than a summary dismissal on an ambitious rival's word. He went to Maisie that same evening, in the stable yard, where she stood as she did every evening now, with her hand resting on Corvus's broad neck. "Your father was innocent," he said, without preamble, because he had learned by then that she preferred plain truth to careful softening. Kettering fabricated the whole of it to secure his own advancement, and my father never troubled to examine the accusation before ending a 15-year servant's livelihood on the strength of it. I cannot undo what that cost your father, Maisie. I cannot give him back the 3 years he spent disgraced, or the years he might have had if the shame hadn't hastened his death. But I can clear his name properly, in every stable in this county, and I intend to do exactly that, publicly, starting with a notice in the same papers that carried the original accusation. Maisie stood very still, her hand still resting on the horse that had known his real trainer's daughter before either of the humans standing in that yard had understood why. "That is more than I ever thought to hope for, Your Grace. It is considerably less than your father deserved, and I am sorry it comes 3 years too late to matter to him. I hope it matters, at least to you." Roderick's voice had gone low and unguarded in a way she had not heard from him before. "I have watched you in this yard every morning for a month, Maisie, and I find I have come to understand something about you that has nothing to do with your father's name or this horse's strange loyalty to it. You held your composure through an accusation, and then through a confrontation, and then through a truth that must have cost you considerably more than you have shown me. And I find I have never in my life met anyone who carried difficult things with such plain, unshowy grace. The public clearing of Samuel Tull's name took the better part of the spring. A formal notice in the county papers, a personal letter from the Duke of Aldermore to every stable master who had turned Tull away on the strength of the old accusation, and a small headstone, paid for at Roderick's own insistence, replacing the plain marker Maisie had managed on a servant's wages 3 years before. Maisie stood at the churchyard the day the new stone was set, reading her father's name properly carved for the first time, Samuel Tull, head groom Aldermore, 1801-1817, wrongly accused and rightly cleared, and Roderick stood beside her, not touching her, simply present, the way she had learned he generally was in the moments that mattered most. "He would have liked you," she said finally. "He judged people by how they treated animals, mostly. And I don't believe he'd have found much fault with a man who spent a whole spring chasing down the truth of a stable hand's ruined name rather than let it lie buried and convenient. I find I would like to have known him. He raised a daughter who tamed the one horse in England nobody else could touch, entirely by being exactly, unshowily herself." She was quiet a moment, looking at the fresh cut stone. "I used to be angry that he never fought harder for himself. I understand it better now, having watched what fighting properly for him has actually taken. A duke's own name, 3 months of correspondence, steward's records nobody else would have troubled to request. He had none of that available to him. He had only a dairy herd and a daughter to feed. And I think he judged, rightly enough, that a groom's word against a duke's decision was not a fight a poor man could win, whatever the truth of it." She looked up at Roderick. "I am not angry at him any longer. I am only sorry it took your father's carelessness and your own conscience 3 years apart to finally balance the account he could never have settled alone. I am sorry it took my own family 2 generations to get it right," Roderick said quietly. "I do not think that is a debt I can ever fully discharge, Maisie, whatever notices I place in whatever papers. I mean to spend considerably more than one spring trying. Regardless, Corvus was ridden again by June, for the first time in 3 years, not by a breaker, not by a groom, but by Maisie herself, at her own careful pace, in the same exercise yard where he had first knelt for her, and the whole household gathered at the rail to watch, because word of the strange, patient miracle unfolding in that yard had travelled considerably further than the county by then. It took the whole of May to get there properly. She had spent that month simply sitting near him, then leaning her weight across his back without mounting, then sitting astride him while Roderick held the lead, and the 2 of them stood entirely still for a quarter hour at a time, letting the horse grow accustomed to the shape of trust, rather than rushing him toward it. Pardo, mended fully by then, and considerably braver for having watched the whole process unfold, took to bringing his own quiet observations most mornings, and by the time Maisie finally asked Corvus to walk forward, with her weight settled on his back, half the stable staff had gathered, unbidden, to watch a thing none of them had believed they would ever see. He walked, slow, uncertain, ears working back and forth in a way that told anyone watching closely that some old fear had not entirely left him, but he walked, carrying her the full length of the yard and back again, and when she slid down at the end of it, her hands were shaking, and her face was wet, and she did not trouble to hide either. He remembered how, she said to Roderick, who had come to stand beside her at the rail. Somewhere under 3 years of grief, he remembered how to be ridden properly, because somebody finally gave him the time to find it again instead of demanding it back all at once. "I think," said Roderick, "that is very likely true of a great many creatures, horses and otherwise." Roderick proposed to her in July, in the stable yard rather than any grand setting his rank might have offered, because he had learned, over a spring of watching her, that she trusted plain ground considerably more than polished rooms. I am not asking you to marry a duke's gratitude, Maisie, though gratitude is certainly part of what I feel. Watching what your family's name has cost you, and what you've carried of it without complaint. I am asking because I have spent a whole spring learning that the woman who tamed an unbreakable horse by simply being trustworthy is the same woman I would like to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve. That is not quite a proposal, Your Grace. I am aware. I find important words have grown considerably harder to say plainly the more they actually matter. He took her hand. Marry me, Maisie Toole. Not for your father's cleared name, and not for Corvus's strange loyalty to your family, though I confess both have taught me a great deal about what kind of household I want to build. Marry me because I have watched you carry difficult truths with more grace than I have managed in 18 months of inheriting my own father's mistakes, and I find I cannot imagine building anything worth having without you standing beside me while I try to do better by it. They were married that autumn, and Corvus, fully gentled by then, ridden daily. The terror of the stable yard transformed into its most trusted mount, was led in polished harness to stand witness at the edge of the churchyard. Because Maisie would not be married anywhere her father's memory and the horse he had trained were not both, in their own way, present for it. Years later, a small girl with her mother's steady hands and her father's watchful patience would be lifted onto Corvus's broad back for her first sitting, laughing, entirely unafraid, and the old horse would stand as gentle and sure beneath her as he had once, on a Friday morning 3 years into his own private grief. Knelt in an exercise yard for a scullery maid who did nothing more remarkable than hum an old, half-forgotten tune and hold out an open hand.